Let me welcome you back to Road to the White House, a MOOC sponsored by Pace University. I'm David Caputo, professor of political science at Pace, and today I want to have the talk with you about the second aspect of the Iowa caucuses. And the last video we talked about how the caucuses actually worked and what was involved. Today, I want to spend a few minutes talking about what I think are the key elements in the results that are likely to come out of Iowa. First of all, for the Democrats, you have Clinton versus Sanders versus O'Malley. The Democratic vote in the state of Iowa is concentrated in the Des Moines area, the capital city, and parts of the Council Bluffs area, but especially along the eastern part of the state alongside the Mississippi River. So the Democrats are spending time in those areas. That's where the bulk of the Democratic vote is. Both Senator Sanders and Secretary Clinton have had extensive field operations in the state of Iowa. Probably upwards of 100 paid staffers and possibly more than 200 volunteers who are working with them on a regular basis. They've invested a lot of time and effort. Some estimates are maybe as much as $250 million will be spent in Iowa as a result of the caucuses. So you can see why Iowa loves the caucuses, because Republicans spend very similar amounts also. So it's a half a billion dollar plus infusion every 4 years. Okay. Now, the key to this race, I think, involves 2 points. Turnout. Okay. Will the Sanders supporters, who evidence indicates are likely to be the newer participants in the caucuses. In other words, they're younger, they haven't participated in caucuses in the past. However, they apparently have, from the polling data that I've seen, they apparently have a much stronger attachment to Senator Sanders. So that being the case, you would expect that perhaps they would turn out in large numbers. That will be a factor. This will be a factor for Mrs. Clinton also. Secretary Clinton is dependent upon party supporters who have been to caucuses on a regular basis, may have even supported her in 2008 when she ran against Barack Obama. But nonetheless, she needs to turn and get her candidates out. If you watch and listen to both candidates, they will tell you they're very confident in their what they call their ground game. And what do they mean by that? Well, they have phone banks set up to call people. They have phone banks set up to say, we'll get you transportation to the caucus if you can't get there on your own. Do you know where your caucus site is? Here it is. Here's how to get there. Here are the rules and so forth. Both, very interestingly, have done videos which they've posted on YouTube and their websites so that people who are interested in going to the caucuses have a chance to do so. So the first thing I would argue is what happens to turnout. The higher the turnout, I would predict that those are probably newer voters, okay, first-time caucus goers, and that will be very beneficial to Senator Sanders. Okay. The other thing, the wild card, every primary, every caucus, every election cycle has certain wild cards. The wild card in Iowa is the weather. I recall once being in Iowa in the 1980s for the caucuses. It was 25 degrees below zero. You could barely step outside. That was air temperature, not wind chill. You could barely step outside and to get to the various headquarters and learn about what was going on. In essence, the state came almost to a halt. That obviously, adverse weather, snow, freezing rain, very cold weather will affect turnout. People are less likely to go out in that kind of weather. So that could be a wild card. Things could happen at the last minute, which could be wild cards. But I think for the Democrats, for Senator Sanders, this is a unique opportunity because he started in Iowa well behind. Some of the polls have him ahead, some have him dead even, some have Secretary Clinton winning. So for Sanders to be able to pull off an upset in Iowa, and it would be considered an upset on his part, would be a major victory. One thing that we know from the polling is that the bulk of the Sanders support comes from white liberals. This will help him in Iowa because the African American population is small. The Hispanic population is not as large as they are in other states. Those are groups that have been very supportive of Mrs. Clinton. So anything can happen. So that's first thing, turnout. Second thing is what happens to the undecided voters. Recent polling shows that between 20 and 30% of those polled say they are not sure how they're going to vote. And this is 4 or 5 days prior to the caucuses. They're not sure. Okay? If those individuals make their mind up for candidate A over candidate B over candidate C, then you could have a very drastic last-minute surge for an individual candidate. So what you want to do when you have an undecided voter, you want to try to tip them to you, but if you can't tip them to you, you want to try to hope that they don't participate. So what happens to the numbers in terms of turnout, and what happens to the undecided vote? Larger undecided vote than usual at this point in Iowa, so it's going to be harder to interpret the results till we get everything counted. And then lastly, I mentioned the perception of what happens in Iowa is extremely important. You have New Hampshire 8 days later. Senator Sanders is expected to win in the state of New Hampshire, although that race is close. The expectation is that he would win. What if he lost Iowa? What does that mean for New Hampshire? Or what if he wins Iowa and comes out of the caucuses with a resounding victory? It puts Secretary Clinton much more on the defensive, and she knows that she has an uphill battle in the state of New Hampshire. So what is she going to be looking for? She's going to be talking about this is a long process. This takes a lot of time. I'm in it for the duration. Okay? When she came in third in 2008, that's basically what she argued, and she was in the process for a long time. So Democratic outcome will be very interesting to watch. It'll have a lot of implications going forward. Is Iowa overrated? I would say yes. Apologies to anyone who's in the MOOC from the state of Iowa. Nonetheless, it is very important, and it's amazing if you stand at the Iowa airport, at the Des Moines airport, the day after the caucuses, all you see are all the news people getting on planes, going on to New Hampshire or back to Washington and so forth. So Iowa, the day after, loses its charm, loses its importance, and people are ready to move on. Same is true of all the other sides. Now, what about the Republican side? Here you have a very interesting race. Donald Trump has tried to make the case that he is invincible, that in fact he will win in Iowa, win in New Hampshire, and run well in the other states. So Iowa is very important to him. He needs to show that in fact he is invincible, and that his predictions in that are true. Hence one of the reasons why in the last 2 weeks he launched such an aggressive attack on Senator Cruz, questioning everything from his conservative credentials to whether or not he has a right to run as a citizen, as a natural-born citizen in the United States and so forth. And basically attacking him personally in terms of him not being a nice person, so forth and so on. So this particular race is important. Now think about this for a second. Who are the three leading, in the polls at least, the three leading vote getters at this point? It is Trump, Cruz, and Rubio. Okay? Three of the more thought of as three of the more conservative candidates. Why is that the case? Many would argue because the Iowa Republican Party is dominated by religious evangelicals who believe very strongly in a very conservative set of principles. And so in Iowa, normally the winner of the Iowa caucuses tends to be a conservative Republican. Now, what does that mean for the more mainstream candidates, or the so-called establishment candidates? It makes it very difficult for someone like Jeb Bush, someone like Governor Kasich, someone like Governor Christie to break through in Iowa. In fact, they're spending most of their time in New Hampshire realizing that they're not going to do very well in the state of Iowa. Now, what about the other conservatives? Santorum's in the race, Rand Paul's in the race, Mike Huckabee still in the race. They're going to have a very difficult time. Carly Fiorina will have a very difficult time in Iowa. So really, the way to interpret the straw ballot, I would argue, is what exactly happens to Trump. If he gets 40% plus in Iowa, and it's possible he could go over 50%, that would be seen as a major victory. Okay? If he wins, but wins 35-28, still a major victory, but it means that Cruz has viability among the conservatives, and perhaps some of the Trump attacks have not been successful. So for the Republicans, I would argue New Hampshire is probably more important than Iowa. Although for Trump, Trump's basic strategy is to say, I'm invincible, I'm going to win everything, you can't stop me. In a lecture, in one of the next 2 lectures, I'll be talking about the strategies of the various candidates, and I'll explain why Trump's invincibility argument is perhaps an interesting one, but it may not guarantee him the nomination prior to the convention. And we'll try to explain that a little bit later. So in going back now, you can see how Iowa plays out for each of the candidates. And it's subject to a lot of interpretation, a lot of analysis. There'll be a lot of discussions in the day or two afterwards, and then everyone will move on to discussing the importance of New Hampshire. And after New Hampshire, 2 weeks later, we get into Nevada and South Carolina for the parties. So this particular set of caucuses, the Iowa caucuses, start the process. Some people argue it's like dropping of the tape for a marathon versus a starter's gun going off, that it's a long process, so it's a dropping of the tape, not a gun that starts the process. So as you hear this, the Iowa caucuses should be over, and that part of the nominating process begins, and we go on, and it'll be very interesting to see if we know who the candidate's going to be by the end of May, early June, or if we aren't going to know till the various nominating conventions. Come back and talk more about that, but keep in mind, follow Iowa closely. Remember, retail politics at its best, large amount of money invested, turnout, and what happens to the undecided voter will determine the outcome in the state of Iowa. Thank you.